Hey, it's Mike D talking about Led Zeppelin on another dark, stormy night in California. Enjoy the dancing flames. So, Led Zeppelin as a kid, I don't recall them too much. I was listening to top 40 AM pop singles like Elton John or Three Dog Night or stuff like that. And they were marketing or targeting the FM radio crowd, much older, kids or teenagers than I who would listen to longer, more complex music. So I kind of missed out on Led Zeppelin until the late 70s. Finally, I would start like taking road trips with friends to like camping or skiing, and someone would play Stairway to Heaven. And it was this deep, complex musical adventure. I had never really heard anything like that. And so it opened a door for me into more complex music. And what a wonderful way to open that door. And as far as I read a great book, really treated myself to a rock biography that I loved. It was called Led Zeppelin, a biography by Bob Spitz. And I learned the whole story of the band. Basically, in the mid 60s, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones they know each other quite well. They are studio musicians, guns for hire. They'll play on any popular radio record, like Dusty Springfield, a hit by her, or Downtown by Petula Clark. I mean, they're on those records. So they just were paid by the hour to do anything, and they got tired of it. Actually, they wanted to jam and improvise and get do their own thing. Really, a musician's dream ultimately. The other two guys were from the farms up north, small towns. They were playing in pubs and bars and were pretty new to the entertainment field. That's Robert Plant and John Bonham. So they all got together, and Jimmy spent a year in the Yardbirds, jamming and being a star on the road. So Jimmy Page had all the experience. It was his band, he was the director, he charted the course. In 1968, he knew that heavier music was getting popular. There was an opening for his type of sound. And the first album was marketed straight to America, and that's where they gained their fame. Not in England, surprisingly. It was in America. The teenagers were hungry for this kind of sexually charged, emotional rock and roll, deeper and heavier than what came before. So they went out on tours all across America, back and forth, and it became pretty apparent that two of the members were getting heavy into drugs and alcohol, and that was John Bonham, the drummer, and Jimmy Page. And you never knew what they were going to do, especially John Bonham. He could get violent and punch someone in the face at a bar, or he could throw a chair out of a hotel window. So you better be careful where you stand. I mean, everybody was on edge. You just didn't really know what was going to happen. It was a volatile situation. And their concerts could be excellent or average or poor. It depended on the combination of drugs and alcohol and what was happening with those concoctions. uh, Very surprising to me. But and then their manager was a big 300-pound tough guy named Peter Grant. He was prone to violence and acting out and freaking out and temper tantrums. So there was another edge of danger and intimidation around Led Zeppelin, like don't mess with this band, um, which worked for them. It paved the road, but it also ran over people as well. And the press hated them. Press They did not give interviews for the press. They did not trust the press, and the press did not like them. Rolling Stone magazine in particular. And their manager, Richard Cole, was also a druggie, a partier guy, and violent. So you would think he'd be calming down the situations on the road as a manager, but he was actually an instigator and part of the craziness and the chaos. So this went on for years. It was a delicate balancing act. Like, could they pull it all together and get to the next city and all show up for the concert and be in tune and give a great performance? I mean, sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. So the first two albums are pretty hard rocking, bluesy affairs, and then the third album I really love. It's gets into acoustical, softer material, and they went out to the country to this cottage and wrote some simple, more lighter material, let's say, and they were into Joni Mitchell. Actually, that was their lighter side. That was not the lead. The lead was the heavy. The Zeppelin was the light. And they got these artists to create these very complicated, magical album covers, and they're real pieces of art. If you really check out these album covers and study them, they had sometimes they would take months and months and delay the album just to get the cover right and the printing and the ink. And at one point, Peter Grant, the manager, went to the artist's house and beat him up because he wanted the cover on deadline. I mean, that could happen in the Led Zeppelin organization. One never knew, but they could also be really nice and wonderful too. It just depended on what they needed at any given moment. So, Led Zeppelin 4 was probably their biggest selling classic album. It just launched them into the stratosphere. It has no name. It's just symbols. It's like ZOSO. It's just four symbols, and made them a super group. And they ended up just playing alone, no opening band. It's just an evening with Led Zeppelin. They played long concerts, 2.5, 3 hours. They got into solos. Bonzo, the drummer, had a long solo. They liked it. They liked jamming and improvising, and they would throw in like Elvis Presley or Chuck Berry numbers, like things like Jailhouse Rock. And so they had a sense of humor, and they would like to do humorous jams on early rock and roll, and even like a Las Vegas kind of number. Just really fun. That was their lighter side, like I said, and no one else really did that. So they kind of had it all to themselves. So all throughout the 70s, I mean, they were the cool, mysterious hard rock band. Jimmy Page, yes, he was a student of the occult. He bought Aleister Crowley's mansion, and he opened an occult bookstore, and it influenced his life and his work. And I don't know how much the others really were into it. I don't think they were as much, but once again, Jimmy was the director or leader of the band. And so then they get into Houses of the Holy and physical graffiti. I mean, they're playing massive stadiums at this point. Like in Tampa, I think they played to 70,000 people. And but they also had scary situations. Like sometimes there would be rainstorms, and they would demand a roof be on the stage, but then the water would leak off the roof, and they'd be afraid of getting electrocuted. And at one point, they ran off the stage in Florida because they were fearful of the rain and the being shocked, and it caused a riot, and the fans stampeded and followed them to the airport, and they barely made it on the plane, and they're just flying out of there before the fans can storm the airport. There's some crazy stuff and that followed them around, and so it's a book chock full of interesting stories. Once again, it's called Led Zeppelin: A Biography by Bob Spitz. And then they spend a lot of time and energy on this movie. The song remains the same, but it wasn't complete footage of their songs, so they had to intercut and edit it, and they were wearing different outfits, and it was performed on different nights. It was kind of an editing nightmare to create this concert, and they had fantasy footage. Um, I think, see, this part I remember. By the late 70s, this movie played at like midnights in theaters, and their fans loved it. I mean, they could, smoke pot and watch this fantasy concert and get off on it. I remember it as being a cool thing to do, to go see The Song Remains the Same on a Saturday night. And it was something that the teenagers could call their own. And I don't think the teenagers really reviewed it that critically. They just enjoyed seeing a really cool concert film. And I even, when I worked in high school, I was in the stage crew. We even played it, in our theater and auditorium, and people loved it. So I do recall that. But things started to take a dark turn around that time, 76. Robert Plant was in a car accident. He broke his leg. They had to record the next album with him in a wheelchair, and it's called Presence, and it's more of a hard rock album. It was another big number 1 platinum selling album again for the band, and they carried on, but they were touring less at that point. And then in late 77, it all came to a head. Uh, they had a concert in Oakland, and Peter Grant and the managers were assaulting another person backstage. It was a minor incident, but it blew up, and someone was beaten up, and then they went up against Bill Graham's management. He was a really powerful guy in the Bay Area, and you really don't want to cross him. So Bill Graham had his people surround Led Zeppelin, and so that they could not leave the venue. And it was just a horrific situation. And they ended up arresting 3 people in Led Zeppelin's entourage, like the drummer and the 2 managers. And they had assault charges. Just horrible. And then Led Zepp flew to their next concert in New Orleans, and Robert Plant got a call his son had died. And so Led Zeppelin never performed in the US again. That was it, that last show marred by violence. And so he was devastated. He was depressed. He just went home to his farm for like a year. And finally, I mean, they had an album, they had a record contract. They had to go back and make a record. So punk rock was real popular at the time and new wave, and they tried to change their sound. Jimmy Page was wasted on heroin at this point. So John Paul Jones took up the leadership in the making of the album, and he had a synthesizer. So it's a different kind of a pop rock synthesizer album. It's called In Through the Outdoor. I love it. It's my favorite record. I remember when that came out in the summer of 79, and everyone got that record and everyone played it. That part I do remember. It was the record to get that year. And All of My Love, Beautiful Ballad, and Caras Alhambra, just it's one of my favorite records. And like I said, it's not as hard rocking, it's more mid-tempo melodic with synthesizers, because John Paul Jones took direction of the band at that point. So then they performed a couple of big concerts called Nebworth in England. And like I said, they were very aware of punk rock, and they went to punk shows. And um, had they stayed together, I think they would have changed with the times. They really became friends with a band called The Damned, and were kind of feeding off their energy. They thought it was cool in a way. And they probably would have cut down on some of their long solos and things like that. They were shifting and changing. So they by 1980 they had a tour of Europe, and things were going pretty good. And then John Bonham, was drinking so much that he just simply, drank himself to death basically at a rehearsal right before they went to America. So they broke up, but they had one more album to produce in their contract, and it was called Coda, and it was studio tracks that were in the vault. There's kind of a shorter, punkier song called Wearing and Tearing. And like I said, they were trying to make music to respond a little bit to the newer music coming out. You might want to check out that tune and just some of their classic cuts. And Coda came out in '82. I remember that a lot of people bought it in high school and were listening to it. They knew it was the last of Led Zeppelin. So they got back together for Live Aid. They did a show there, um, and a few little bits and pieces of partial reunions along the way. But the book ends with they finally did this big concert in 2007 called Celebration Day, and the band was fantastic that night. They all got it completely together and did this great show. And for once in their life, they had great reviews. People loved the live show, and they made a video of it. It's called Celebration Day. I would highly recommend you watch that concert and just enjoy the majesty and the power of Led Zeppelin. So I'm Mike D. My work is at Down Pepper Tree Lane, my shop with antiques and jewelry, cool stuff. Check out downpeppertreelane.com, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.